Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Camano. I am the Planned Giving Director for the Arizona Foundation for Women, and I'm really glad you joined us today. So I want to go over a couple things on this new On24 platform in case you've never been here before. And then I'm going to give a brief introduction about Arizona Foundation for Women. And then I'm going to welcome and introduce Judy Smith. So first of all, in On24, you can move around these little boxes on your desktop by clicking on the top bar and kind of moving them around. You can also make them bigger. On the bottom right corner, you should be able to click and then drag it out. And so in case you want to see me really big on your screen, you can do that. Of course, I'm talking about the slides. That will be more important. And then you can type into the Q&A if you're having any other trouble that I can possibly help you with without disturbing Judy. So I want to thank you all for joining us today for the Arizona Foundation for Women's Financial Independence Seminars. Together with members of our Professional Advisors Committee, we bring you information from experts that can help you make critical financial decisions that affect you, your business, your family, and hopefully your community. At Arizona Foundation for Women, we work to advance the status of Arizona's women through research, advocacy, and philanthropy to ensure their safety, health, and economic empowerment. This year marks our 25th anniversary. Although we have all been affected by an incredibly challenging year, it has been especially tough on women. 4 times as many women as men dropped out of the labor force in September. Roughly 865,000 women compared with 216,000 men. Most of it is to provide childcare or help kids via Zoom do their schoolwork. Between March and April of this year, the unemployment rate in Arizona grew from 4.5% to 5.5%. 57% of all new unemployment claims were female. They represent 48% of the workforce. In the U.S., mothers are 47% more likely to lose their job or quit, and 14% are more likely to be furloughed since the start of the crisis. Most of this is for childcare reasons when they are making this decision themselves. Globally, this is striking. 70% of healthcare workers are first responders, and first responders are women, and therefore they're at a higher risk of exposure while also bearing most of the childcare responsibilities. In Arizona, Phoenix shelters have reported a 50% drop in shelter capacity due to COVID safety guidelines. And at the same time, the Phoenix police have reported an uptick in domestic violence crisis calls and a 140% increase in homicide related to domestic violence. This is a really tough time for women. Our work in research, advocacy, and programming is needed now more than ever. Please, if you have clients or friends who are interested in helping Arizona's women, feel free to reach out to me, Jennifer Camano. So now I would like to welcome Judy Smith. I just love Judy. She sat in on one of my interviews, and boy, did she have a bunch of questions for me that were tough. She is a philanthropic consultant with 30 years in the nonprofit arena. Her experience spans higher ed, development and alumni relations, national and international philanthropy, and the arts. Currently, besides being so many other things, Judy is the president of the Planned Giving Roundtable of Arizona. And she was formerly the senior director of Planned Giving at the Arizona Community Foundation, where she directed the Arizona Endowment Building Institute and taught the Planned Giving 100 and 200 education series for nonprofits around the state. Thank you so much for joining us today, Judy, and I shall let you take it over from here.
Thank you, Jennifer. Those statistics and the information you provided about Arizona women is certainly sobering. And I always have to start out with a disclaimer. You know, Jennifer said I was an expert. Well, I have lots of experience, but I'm not an attorney. I'm not a CPA. I'm not even a certified financial advisor. So I'm going to be giving you some ideas that you should take to your professional advisors if one of them resonates with you, because everyone's situation is different. And as we look at how this crazy year is really different, let's talk about some of the charitable opportunities that you have for 2020. So charitable giving in 2020, what a year. You know, the first time I had any inkling that something was going to be really different about this year, I was in a book club meeting in February, and two women, one of whom had been to Costco and one of whom had been to the grocery store, were talking about the run on toilet paper. Someone had seen someone leaving Costco with a cart full of toilet paper, and someone had been to the grocery store and said the shelves were almost bare. And I was puzzled, but by the time I got to the grocery store on the weekend, the shelves were bare. And that kind of led us into what kind of a crazy year we're going to have. So much has happened that affects the giving opportunities that happen at the end of the year. Really started in December. Congress passed the Secure Act, setting up every community for retirement income. And it went into effect in January. And although there were many provisions in that act, one of the things that the Secure Act did was change the required minimum distribution from IRAs from age 70 and a half to 72. They also set up some provisions that said if you were still working after age 70 and a half, you could continue contributing to your IRAs, which was good news for workers. And then they changed some rules about how non-spouses could inherit, well, not inherit, but liquidate IRAs they had inherited. And they did something kind of smart with 529 plans. So let's look at how those things that the Secure Act set up might affect charitable giving as we get into this crazy giving season at the end of the year. I want to table what I'm going to tell you about required minimum distributions because the CARES Act that came along in March changed everything and threw it up in the air. So we'll talk about required minimum distributions when we get to the CARES Act. But I do want to talk about those continuing contributions to IRAs, the death of what we call the stretch IRA and the 529 plans. So let me give you just kind of a heads up. And again, I'm going to direct you to your own tax planners if you are in this situation. But if you're 70 and a half or older and you continue to have earned income that you could contribute to an IRA, I just want to give you a heads up to make you think about what could happen down the road. So I've given you an example here that your pre-70 and a half balance in your IRA was $95,000. I have to do simple math. I'm an English major, sorry. But interestingly enough, surprising to me, the average balance in an IRA this year was $58,000. So $95,000 might not be an implausible amount. But after age 70 and a half, this mythical person added $5,000 to their IRA. And then a few years later, they decided they wanted to take out $10,000 to give to their favorite charity. And to their surprise, that $5,000 that they put in after age 75 does not count as a qualified charitable distribution. Now, a qualified charitable distribution is when money comes out of a traditional IRA and goes directly to a charity for a charitable purpose. And the reason people do that is because they don't have to pay income tax on it. If you have a traditional IRA, you were able to put that money into your IRA without paying tax on the front end. So the government wants a bite of it when it comes out on the back end. And of course, the theory is that you're putting that money in when you're in a high income situation. And when you're retired and taking it out, your income is likely to be lower. But for many people, those withdrawals from an IRA put them in a higher tax bracket. So I just want you to be aware that any money that goes into an IRA after age 70 and a half, when it comes out, is not going to be eligible for that qualified charitable distribution. It is going to be taxed as part of your income. Not saying you shouldn't do it. Every person's situation is different. But again, I do want to direct you to the person who helps you with your taxes to figure out what's right for you. So that was one of the things that the Secure Act did. The next thing I want to talk about is what we're calling a stretch IRA. Spouses have always had what we call portability. A husband can inherit from her wife, a wife can inherit from her husband, a husband can inherit from a husband, or a wife can inherit from a wife with no problem. It's always been portability for spouses. The problems, tax problems, not other problems, come into being when non-spouse inheritors get those IRAs. And very typically, the scenario is that one of the couple dies first, the other half of the couple inherits the IRA, and then at the end of the second spouse, very often those IRAs are designated to go to the spouse's children. Until the Secure Act was passed, those children had their lifespan to withdraw the money from the IRA. So if they were 50 years old and they had a 35-year lifespan, they had time for that IRA to grow and come out, over a longer period of time. The Secure Act changed that. It said that with few exceptions, and there are 5 exceptions, I'm not going to remember what they are. One of them is if the person is legally disabled who would inherit them. One of them is if the inheritor is a minor child of the annuitant, which is probably not likely, but possible. And there are 3 others. I don't remember what the exceptions are. But typically, most children, if they're adult children, will be in their highest income years. If they inherit in their 50s or 60s, they're likely to be earning at the highest level in their careers and having to take that money out in a 10-year period. And they can leave it in for the full 10 years as long as it comes out, within that 10-year period. So again, this is something that I'm going to refer you to your professional advisors about. But more than ever, this makes an IRA a good asset to give to charity. There are also ways that it could be set up through your estate in a testamentary vehicle, whether it would be a trust or a charitable gift annuity, that would let that IRA balance go to specific individuals over a long period of time. And again, your attorneys can help you with those scenarios. I had to put my dog in, and I'll apologize in advance if you hear her bark. She has been my constant companion for the last 8 months. She's not sitting beside me right now. She usually is, but she's very happy. And when she's on her back and asking me to rub her tummy, and this is a happy piece of the Secure Act. One of the things that the Secure Act did is let 529 plans, which are specifically for post-secondary education, be used up to $10,000 to pay student debt. So that's a good piece of news. And it should help millennials and their parents who may be helping those millennials with their student debt as they repay their college loans. So again, I see that as a positive and not a downside for charitable giving, but it's something that I wanted to make you aware of. Okay, now let's talk about the CARES Act. The CARES Act was signed into law in March, and it is the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Secure Act. This is the act that if your household had income of less than 100,000, sent you checks, or if there were children in the household, there was a $500 check for each child in the household. It also extended unemployment benefits or added on to unemployment benefits because so many people were without work. And interestingly enough, it waived some penalties for early withdrawals from IRAs if they were for COVID relief. And again, I'm going to refer you to your advisors here if you're in a situation where you do need to borrow from your IRA, because there are provisions both for borrowing from an IRA and paying it back, I believe, over a 3-year period, or even just taking it out and not paying it back without that 10% penalty that has to be paid for early withdrawal. So those are some of the general provisions. But the ones that I really want to talk about that I think are considerations for charitable giving, you'll recall that when we talked back about the Secure Act, we said that required minimum distributions from traditional IRAs went to age 70 and a half, or for age 72 from 70 and a half. Well, in March, when they passed the CARES Act, they said, forget it. Nobody has to do a required minimum distribution in 2020. Nobody at all. It doesn't matter how old you are. And part of that, my understanding is that the tax tables are being revised, and they're using this as a way to kind of level the scales for the future. But there are no required minimum distributions from IRAs. Now, that doesn't mean that people can't take a qualified charitable distribution from their IRA. If they're 70 and a half or older, they can still do that. They're just not required to, so there's no income tax incentive. They also instituted a $300 above-the-line deduction for charitable gifts. And that's important because if you think back, now I'm referencing another act. In 2017, Congress passed the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, and that changed so many people's opportunity to itemize their deductions. So this $300 above the line deduction for charitable gifts is for the 90% of households that don't itemize. And then the one that I really want to talk about is the 100% of adjusted gross income charitable deductions, again, for 2020 only. So I want to go back to the required minimum distributions. Since the Tax Cuts and Job Act, when so many people haven't been able to itemize their deductions, we've seen a couple of trends. One of them is that people are bunching their deductions. They might give an organization a lot of money in 1 year so they can itemize their taxes, and then they wouldn't give any additional money for several years. That's why we've seen such a growth in donor-advised funds, because people will put the money into a donor-advised fund and then continue to make their annual charitable contributions. But because there is no required minimum distribution in 2020, the donors who were using their IRAs basically like a donor-advised fund or as a charitable checkbook have no tax incentive to give. Now, we all know that taxes or tax incentives are only a portion of people's considerations when they make a charitable contribution. Many organizations, I'm sure, are still seeing those qualified charitable distributions from IRAs. But I suspect when the statistics come in for this year, most organizations are going to find that they've received less because their financial advisors are just reminding them, you know, you don't have to worry about paying income tax if you pull it out. So why don't you wait and make a bigger gift next year? So I think we'll see that that's having a negative effect on charitable giving in calendar year 2020. And again, this is only for calendar year 2020. It's a different ballgame next year. Whoops, let's see if I can go forward. The above the line charitable deduction, I think, will have a minimal effect on giving this year, even though 90% of taxpayers now take the standard deduction instead of itemizing. Before the Tax Cut and Jobs Act passed in 2017, about 2/3 of households did not itemize their taxes, and about 1/3 did. And now we've seen 23% of the households no longer itemize. It's down to about 10% of taxpayers. So this is something that if you take the standard deduction, and that's because they raised the standard deduction, it's $24,000 for a married household, $12,000 single, $18,000 for head of household. So if you take the standard deduction and you no longer itemize your taxes, then please make sure to remember to give $300 to one of your favorite organizations somewhere, like Arizona Foundation for Women, and make sure that when you file your tax return that you take that $300 deduction. Now, it is per household. It is not per taxpayer, so it's only $300. However, I think the fact that Congress did put that into effect for 2020 opens the door for Congress to do some future considerations down the road as they look at what some of these legislative decisions have done for nonprofits, or to nonprofits, perhaps I should say. Now, I really want to talk about the 100% of adjusted gross income deductions for cash contributions. Now I'm talking to the 10% of households who do itemize their deductions. Notice that it is for cash contributions. It's not real estate, it's not stock. And these are for the organizations that formerly could have donors deduct up to 60% of cash contributions of their adjusted gross income. There are some limitations on the type of organizations that can receive these 100% deductions. Unfortunately, one of those types of organizations is a supporting organization, which is what Arizona Foundation for Women is. However, there is a workaround. There's always a workaround. And I would advise you to reach out to Jennifer Camano or to Misha Davis, the executive director, if you decide that you're interested with your tax advisor, if you decide that you're interested in a cash contribution that would allow you to deduct 100% of your adjusted gross income, visit with them and find out the right way to do it. Don't just send a check to Arizona Foundation for Women and expect to get a 100% adjusted gross income for your cash contributions. Now, interestingly enough, and again, back to your financial advisor, but this is an interesting possibility, I think, for people to consider converting a Roth IRA to a traditional, or converting a traditional IRA to a Roth IRA and taking advantage of that contribution. Let me explain what I mean. With a Roth IRA, the annuitant pays the taxes, the income tax, on the front end. So they don't have a required minimum distribution. They can leave it in there to grow. It can pass on to children. It's almost the opposite of a traditional IRA, where you defer the taxes on the front end and then you pay the taxes on the back end. So if your financial advisor has been talking to you about the possibility of converting your traditional IRA to a Roth IRA and you decide that's an advantage, I would sit down with your tax advisor, figure out what kind of a charitable contribution you would need to make to offset the income tax that you would pay for that Roth IRA. It's just something to think about and discuss with your financial planners so that you have an idea. And that's a unique opportunity for 2020 only. The presumption is that it will sunset on December 31. So it's something to think about. There are a lot of advantages of Roth IRAs. I think the reason most people or many people don't have them is because they don't want to pay the taxes on the front end. But there are advantages in how you can pass them on to heirs and the fact that you don't have to withdraw the funds. So take a look at that. The other one that's also kind of an interesting wrinkle, I think, for 2020 is that I would say not very often, but maybe once or twice a year, someone would reach out to me and ask about the opportunity to get savings bonds. If you think about savings bonds, those are those government-issued securities. They're set up for a certain amount of time. You buy in for a relatively low price, and then over time, they grow in value. And the way savings bonds are set up, they have to be, and except for this year, they have to be given to a nonprofit through an estate gift. But if you were able to use your 100% of adjusted gross income deduction for a cash contribution, it might be worth it to liquidate the savings bond, pay the tax on the growth, and then give the cash to your favorite organization. So just a planning opportunity that you might not have thought about that you might want to discuss with your financial advisors. And I'll throw one more at you that's not on the slide, but it occurred to me later. I know that a lot of people have paid up whole life insurance policies that maybe they bought a long time ago when their kids were little, or they were worried that something would happen to the breadwinner and it's sitting in a safety deposit box or a desk drawer. And converting a life insurance policy to a charitable contribution since 2006 has been kind of a pain. But again, you might be able to cash in that policy that you don't really need, that your family doesn't need anymore, pay the tax, and give the proceeds to your favorite organization, whether it's AFW or another one. So just something to think about as we're going into this crazy end of the year giving season. You know, I've heard various statistics, but really from the last 90 days of the year, this is when most of the gifts of stock are made. This is when most of the charitable contributions are made. And it's almost a frenzied season. So these are just some perhaps tax smart ways to look at your giving at the end of the year as you sit down with your advisors and your family and figure out what's right for you. So it is a weird and unique year, starting with toilet paper shortages, and who knows how it's going to end. I hope that this presentation has helped you avoid some missteps as you plan for what you might do now and in the future with your traditional IRA. I hope it's given you some thoughts, if you itemize your taxes, about a cash contribution that you and your professional advisors could plan out together for an IRA. And I hope that you realize that Congress changes the tax code all the time. And these are just two things that happened in 2020. 2021 will be on us in, less than 90 days. So just kind of plug in and stay tuned for updates that can affect you in the future. And I think that may be my last slide. There's my contact information if you'd like it. And Jennifer, did we have any questions, or did I put them to sleep?
I don't think you put them to sleep. I'm certainly not asleep. I do have one question from Susan Santalina at Smiles and Beyond. She's curious about the federal, the 2020 CARES Act deductions. Does the donation need to be made in 2020, or can it be made up until April 15th of 2021?
No, it sunsets December 31. It's not like Arizona tax credits. It has to be made in calendar year 2020.
And my understanding, actually, after talking to you, is because AFW is a supporting organization of the Arizona Community Foundation, I know that DAFs and supporting orgs cannot receive a QCD, but our workaround is to create a designated fund. And so we can accept those. What about that $300 and for itemizers, the 100% off AGI? Can those go to supporting orgs? I'm not sure that they can.
The 100% of adjusted gross income cannot go to a supporting org, a donor advised fund, a private foundation. Can't be used to set up a charitable gift annuity. The $300 for non-itemizers, that's an above the line tax situation. I think it's probably, and again, check with your financial advisor, remember that disclaimer, but because they're not asking for a lot of documentation on that $300 above the line deduction for non-itemizers, I would guess that it can, but I'm not 100% positive because I'm not a CPA. But the logic tells me that it probably would, because you're not itemizing. It's the 100% that they're really sticky about.
Okay, I wasn't sure about that myself. Does anyone have any other questions? It sure has been a crazy year, though, hasn't it? Well, we're only 30 minutes in, so I'm happy to take other questions from anybody about your organization, or maybe, Judy, if I actually learned about that, converting the traditional IRA to the Roth IRA, because I looked at Russell James's end of year tax tips yesterday. But I wondered if you could share, because I think of several people on the call do represent organizations, which, nonprofits. Could you talk about ways we could communicate with our people in our nonprofits, end of year tax tips? What else should we be telling them? For sure, the $300, and then for itemizers, the 100% AGI, but what else?
Well, I think it's always, I can't believe, part of me says I can't believe, and part of me says, Judy, you're being silly. I can't believe that anybody who has an IRA is not aware that they don't have to take a contribution this year. I believe that word has gotten out. What I think people don't realize is that if they want to make a contribution, a qualified charitable deduction from a traditional IRA, that they can do that. So that word might be something like, you don't have to, but you could, So that's a piece of something. And I think if you need to think of your organizations as two different groups. Try to think about the itemizers and the non-itemizers. And especially if and I didn't go into this because it doesn't have anything to do with federal law, but if you're an organization that is eligible for Arizona tax credits, which can be given up until April of the next year. If you're an organization that is eligible for that, then by all means, make your case. But as nonprofits, probably the best way to make your case is to show the impact. And if I were going to reach out to my non-itemizers, the people, and if I were just looking at my database, I would look at the people who have maybe given less than $1,000 in the last 5 years, and remind them that now they can only take one $300. It's not like they can deduct $300 from 5 different organizations, but remind them of the impact. What would $300 do for your organization? Would it shelter a homeless person for a month? Would it buy sheet music for the school orchestra for one concert? Would it feed a family of 4 for 2 weeks? I mean, whatever those impact statements are, if I really wanted to make a year-end case on what $300 would do, I would come up with 3 or 4 different examples of the impact $300 could have to your organization, and reach out to those folks with that $300 opportunity, just reminding them, because that's not something that's been widely covered. You do want to segment your appeals, I think, when you're reaching out to people. When you think about the people who are itemizing, then, that's a different story. Then that's when you talk with them about, you might even think about a way to offer bunching your contributions. If you don't have the ability to issue donor advised funds, for example, you could ask your donors to give you $10,000 and tell them that it would credit their annual fund gift or make them a member of the President's Club or whatever your, $2,500 club is for 4 years. Now, your CFO is going to hate you, because your CFO is going to have to track that money and release it, on an annual basis. But it's something that you could think of strategically about how to get people who don't ordinarily itemize, but who might bunch their deductions every 3 or 4 years to do that. So those are just a couple of ideas.
That's helpful. Thank you. I'm curious about the RMD. Is there going to be, I know that some people have done mortgage forbearance, and at the end of that, you have several options, but the mortgage companies certainly ask for all of that principal and interest from those past 3 to 6 months. Is there anything like that with the RMD? So next year at this time, are people going to have to take double the RMD? Or
No.
I feel like there's some kind of argument for making a QCD this year, in part because it can lower their overall RMD requirement next year. Does that make sense?
Well, now their RMD next year is going to be the same. So no, it doesn't have, there's not a double dip next year. So if they were going to have to give 3.5% this year, they're not going to have to give much more than that next year. What Congress is trying to do with giving that 1.5 year difference is they're adjusting their rate tables by age, and people are living longer. So they're trying to even it out for those people who are having to give it 70.5 to the people who hadn't started yet, and just giving everybody a year off. So there's not a double dip next year. There are pros and cons, and this is why people need to visit with their financial advisors about their own situation. There is absolutely no tax incentive to give from an IRA this year a qualified charitable distribution. But again, a lot of those qualified charitable distributions from IRAs, the taxes are only part of the consideration. They're giving to your organization because they love your organization. And if you make a case about why a $5,000 gift, a $10,000 gift, whatever, make an impact gift, what their gift could do this year, then just like any other appeal, you've reached out to those people who are ordinarily giving to you through their IRAs and giving them an opportunity to continue their support for your organization. It's not taxes, it's love.
It's love. Love wins.
It's
I
love.
like it.
It's a hard deal.
So I think that's us. That comes to an end. Is there anything else you wanted to add? Are there any other last minute questions? Pop them in the menu. I
just applaud the people who signed on to hear about taxes on a cold free. It was 27 this morning when I got up. So I'm in northern Arizona. But I applaud you for signing on to hear about taxes. I would encourage you, as you're thinking about your year-end planning, to remember the Arizona Foundation for Women. As Jennifer told you at the beginning, the need is great, and your dollars could have a significant impact. I'm sure if you're on this call, you already think about the Arizona Foundation for Women. But they're a great organization. They do wonderful work in supporting women across the state of Arizona. And just remember them when you're thinking about your year-end giving.
Thanks, Judy. I also wanted to share that if you do need any help with estate planning, financial advice, we do have our Professional Advisors Committee. And if you go to our website, azfw.org, and you click on volunteer, you'll see the Professional Advisors Committee right under that volunteer tab. And we have a list of folks and their contact information. So if you don't have anyone, but you have a few questions, we've got a great advisors committee. Thank you so much, Judy. I really do treasure our relationship, and that I can call you and be like, what do I do about this? So I appreciate that so much. And thank you all. Wait, I'm looking at a question that popped up. Let me see if I can. Are the slides going to be made available?
It's fine with me.
Yes, and I'm not sure. I'm going to have to ask my people how to make those available, but I can certainly share them with you, Mary. I know Mary from Arizona Heartfelt Hounds. So we will follow up. I think the whole recording and the PowerPoint that you shared is in our thanks for attending email. So everyone will have access to that. You'll get a little email with all the links. So I'll make sure the PowerPoint is in there. And thank you so much. Everyone have a beautiful day.
Welcome.
One more. Great. Love you both. Okay. Sorry. It was another little comment in the Q&A, but it was all love.
Okay.
All right. Thanks everyone for joining us. We are going to have one last thing. We are going to have more talks next spring, possibly January, February. And Judy, you mentioned late April is always a good time to revisit some of the tax things. So I think we're planning on it.
Yeah, when people have had to write those checks to the IRS, and believe me, if you have to write a check to the IRS, you don't do it until you have to. So April is a good time to remind people that there are ways that they can do a better job of not supporting the IRS and supporting charities they love instead. So April's a great time. Late April's a great time to remind your donors that if they love you, they can also be tax smart.
Yay, I love it. So we'll follow up, keep an eye out on our website for more details on next year's, 2021's financial independence seminars. All right, signing off. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Bye, everybody.